Let me kind of do some review with you if you're new with us, or maybe you've been away for a little bit. Let me just give you a little bit of a review time. We are in a sermon series I've entitled Time Spent with the Master. And what we're doing is we're looking at Peter's life. And we're finding some parallels, and we're drawing some connecting lines between his life and ours, and making some practical application that we see how he has been transformed by his time spent with the Master, and the same thing can happen for us. The first week we were together, we learned that this man named Simon had an extraordinary potential. That when people looked at Simon and they knew Simon, they saw a fisherman. But when Jesus Christ looked at Simon, he saw Peter, a rock. Someone who was stable, someone who was foundational, someone who was very important, who was going to be dependable to the kingdom of God. And I hope that you grabbed onto the truth that week that when Christ looks at you, when he looks at me, he sees somebody who is absolutely imperative to his kingdom. You and Christ together will do some amazing things for his kingdom that only you and Christ can do. The second week we learned that Simon Peter had an extraordinary calling. Jesus gave Simon Peter a summons to a new way of life. That was what we defined a calling as. And Jesus gave the invitation to Simon Peter and said, "Hey, come follow me and I will make you fishers of men." There are some things that you're used to doing. There are some things that you're kind of familiar with doing. You're used to catching fish. We're going to take what you're used to doing and we're going to apply that to my kingdom. I'm commissioning you to now come join me to invite and influence people, mankind, for his kingdom. And I pray that last week you were inspired to accept the call that Jesus Christ has laid on your heart, because he has called you. You've been invited. And if we will but follow through with the calling that he has issued to us, to invite and to influence people for God's kingdom using our time, our talents, and our resources that he's gifted us with, we're going to realize that there's a great blessing to be had. As a matter of fact, if you remember last week, we were reminded that we have to be obedient to our call. We should be obedient to our call, even when we don't feel like it. Even if things aren't, going the way that we think they should go. When I'm not feeling it, God. And when it doesn't make sense to me. When it defies my understanding and when it defies logic, I need to be obedient to do the things you've called me to do. And why should I do that? So that I can receive the blessing that you have in store for me. Think about what Peter got to experience because he was willing to follow Jesus Christ. He got to write about and experience some awesome stories. Well, today I'm excited that you're here because today we're going to learn, as Peter learned and was reminded about, God's extraordinary potential. God's extraordinary, provision. Extraordinary provision. God provides. And I think that this sermon comes at an appropriate time, a very God-ordained time, as we're getting ready to celebrate Thanksgiving, right? As we're getting ready to give a Thanksgiving offering, we're going to be reminded that God provides. Not just a little bit, extraordinarily provides. I've been asking different groups of people this question throughout the week. I asked Can Do Kids. I asked my Sunday school class. I'm going to ask you. As you are getting ready to experience a Thanksgiving dinner with your friends, with your family, raise your hand if you are a white meat. If you prefer white meat out of your turkey, raise your hands. Okay, I prefer white meat. Raise your hands if you prefer dark meat. It looks like it's about 50-50, right? And I'm a white meat kind of guy, and all of you dark meat kind of people, you're like, well, but it's so dry and it's not. That's why they make gravy, right? But let me just give you a little glimpse of God's great provision as we're going to sit down and we're going to thank God for all the things he's blessed us with and he's given to us. He provided a bird that provides both white meat and dark meat. Talk about extraordinary provision even in that, right? This morning we come to Matthew chapter 14, and Matthew chapter 14 is really a great chapter because there are miracles that are like back to back to back to back. we're going to study two miracles that are back to back. Jesus is just like doing some extraordinary things. And the reason that he's going to do these miracles is because he's going to remind his followers that he provides for them. He provides extraordinarily for them. So as we open up the pages of chapter 14 of Matthew's Gospel, God's kingdom has suffered a devastating blow to the momentum that it had been gaining. John the Baptist has been silenced. He has been beheaded by Herod. You remember John the Baptist, don't you? He was the guy who baptized Jesus Christ in the Jordan River. He was the guy who first went toe-to-toe with the religious leaders, the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And he called them out for what they were. Do you remember what strong language he used for them? Brood of vipers, right? That was John the Baptist who first did that. It was also John the Baptist who was described by Jesus Christ as being the greatest man to ever be born. Greater than Abraham, greater than Moses. John the Baptist. That guy is now dead. This was a blow to John's followers, but I think it was also a blow to Jesus' followers as well. I mean, imagine with me what they must have been sensing, what they must have been feeling, what they must have been thinking in that moment when they received the news that Herod beheaded John the Baptist. Where was God at? Why didn't God protect John the Baptist? Why didn't God provide a way of escape for John the Baptist? After all, he was faithful to his call. He was doing what God was telling him to do and going where God was telling him to go. And this is the result? Where are you, God? And so with that as a backdrop, we now come to our text. And in Matthew chapter 14, there are going to be two miracles that I want to study for us this morning. And what's so impressive with these two miracles is that, as I said before, they're back to back. It's like boom, boom, here we go. Here's the key thought for this morning that I want you to grab and walk away with today, okay? God provides what is needed in order to achieve what is necessary. I'll say that again. God provides what is needed in order to achieve what is necessary. That's what we're going to soon realize in these two miracles that Jesus performs. Okay, so as we read Matthew chapter 14, keep that key thought in your mind. God provides what is needed in order to achieve what is necessary. Okay, you with me? All right, let's begin reading now in Matthew chapter 14, starting in verse 13. Now when Jesus heard about John the Baptist, about his death, about him being beheaded, Jesus withdrew from there in a boat to a secluded place by himself. And when the people heard of this, they followed Jesus on foot from the cities. When Jesus went ashore, he saw a large crowd, and he felt compassion for them, and he began to heal their sick. When it was evening, the disciples came to Jesus and said, "This place is desolate, and the hour is already late. So send the crowds away, that they may go into the villages and buy food for themselves." But Jesus said to them, "They do not need to go away. You give them something to eat." The disciples said to Jesus, "We have only here 5 loaves and 2 fish." And Jesus said, "Bring them here to me." Ordering all the people to sit down on the grass, he took the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, and looking up towards heaven, he blessed the food, and breaking the loaves, he gave them to the disciples, and the disciples gave them to the crowds. Verse 20, and they all ate and were satisfied. They picked up what was left over, the broken pieces, 12 full baskets. There were about 5,000 men who ate, besides women and children. So there it is. There's the first miracle, feeding the multitudes. God provided what is needed in order to achieve what is necessary. Let me ask you this. What is needed in that situation? What was it that was their need? Look back at verse 15. Let me read it again, and I want to see if you notice anything about this. Verse 15 reads, when it was evening, the disciples came to Jesus and said, "This place is desolate, and the hour is already late, so send the crowds away." I believe that it was Peter who came to Jesus with this request. Peter seems to be the spokesman for the group, and I think they're all like, Go tell him. It's late. We're hungry. We haven't eaten. Go tell him to send people away so we can get out of here and go get something to eat. And so Peter approaches and has a little powwow with Jesus. But do you see what Simon is really complaining about? What he's really saying? It's really quite remarkable. He's complaining about the location and the time. He's like, this place is desolate, and the hour is late. He's complaining about the location and the time. I find it very interesting. Follow me on this. I find it very interesting that here in this situation, Peter is complaining in the same manner that he did when Jesus wanted him to go out on a little fishing excursion. Do you remember last week about Peter's calling? Remember how that all came about? Jesus was teaching the crowds, and he decided he was going to use Simon's boat. And he gets done teaching the crowds. He turns to Simon Peter and he says, hey, let's go fishing. Cast out the boat into deep water. Let down your nets for a catch. And that didn't make any sense to Peter. It didn't make any sense because the place and the time that Jesus wanted to do this thing wasn't the right place, and it wasn't the right time to catch fish. But Peter was reminded in that moment, hey, listen, all you are called to do is obey me. I'll take care of the rest. You do what I'm asking you to do. I'll take care of the details. And here again, it's not the right place. It's not the right time. We can't feed these people. And once again, Peter is going to be reminded, just do as I ask. Just do as I ask. I'll take care of the details. The request to his disciples didn't seem to make sense. In fact, they said, send them away. Tell them to go home and go get some food for themselves. And what is Jesus' response? And I love it. The people don't need to go away. You give them something to eat. Boom. I mean, their eyes and mouths just went, are you kidding me, Jesus? There's over 10,000 people here. 5,000 men plus 5,000 or so women plus kids. And you want us to feed them? Why did Jesus tell them that? Why did Jesus command that you guys feed them? I think the reason that he did that was to make his disciples acutely aware that they did not have the resources necessary to meet the need. Has God ever made you very acutely aware that you did not have what was needed to meet the need of somebody else? Or you didn't have the resources at your disposal to do what God has called you to? Has God ever made you very acutely aware of just how unworthy and how unqualified you are to do what he's asking you to do? Man, I have. Jesus wanted these disciples to see that they could not do it on their own. He wanted them to see the same thing that Abraham discovered as he went out to sacrifice his son Isaac. Do you remember what Abraham told his son? As Isaac's kind of scratched his head, we've got the wood. Where's the sacrifice? Do you remember what Abraham says in that moment? God will provide. Thank you, Dennis. The Lord will provide. That's what he wants his disciples to see. You don't have the resources. There's no stores around. There's not even any fishing gear around. The Lord will provide. And so what happens next? Jesus takes the few fish and the few loaves of bread that were offered to him. And what does he do? He prays for them. He prays about it. He gives thanks to God for the meager what was given here. And then he multiplies them. Question, was the need met? Verse 20. And they all ate and were satisfied. You ever been to a potluck dinner someplace and you're looking at the table and you're like, I'll go ahead and I'll be the last one through the line just in case there's not enough food here for everybody. You ever been that way? By the way, I've never been to a potluck dinner where we didn't have enough food. Have you? It may have looked like it was pretty meager at first, but by the time the last person goes through the line, boy, we found out something. God provided. That's exactly what I think was happening here. Maybe the disciples were like, okay, we'll go without. We'll give to everybody else. But the scripture says that everybody ate. Nobody didn't step to the side and I'll just go hungry. I'll go. Everybody ate and were satisfied. And notice the need was not just met, the need was abundantly met. Verse 20 finishes out by saying, and they all ate and were satisfied. They picked up what was left over of the broken pieces, 12 full baskets. The need wasn't just met, it was abundantly met. What I like about this passage of Scripture is that we learn how God's provision works. Listen to me on this. God multiplies what is humbly brought to him. God multiplies what is humbly brought to him. You see, there is our part. There is our part. We have to be willing to give and let God use what we have. But more importantly, there's God's part. It's important for you to bring the resources, the knowledge, the time, the talents, the abilities. Even if you think that they are not worthy, even if you think there's no way that God can use it, because God's going to show you something, the Lord will provide. He will multiply it to provide for the need that is there. But here's what I want you to notice. I want you to notice the result. What was the result of this miracle? The disciples became aware that God cares about people and that he's capable of meeting needs. Physical needs. Did you know that? Did you know that God can meet your physical needs and that he wants to meet your physical needs? In fact, he's promised to meet your physical needs. Did you know that? Can you just humor me here this morning? Everybody just close your eyes. Everybody just close your eyes for a second. I want you to picture now that you're sitting down to a table and Jesus is across the table from you. And you're sitting down to have coffee with him. Maybe you're sitting down to have a piece of pie with him. You're sitting down to engage in conversation with him. And as you're sitting down with him, you've set this meeting up to tell him about the need that you have. What need do you have right now in your life? I want you to hear his words to you. Keep your eyes closed. You've heard these verses before, but think about like listening to these words for the first time, that Jesus is saying these words to you. Don't be worried about your life as to what you will eat or what you're going to drink, nor for your body as to what you're going to put on it. Life is more than food, and the body is more than clothing. Look at the birds of the air. They do not sow, they don't reap or gather into barns, and yet God feeds them. Are you not worth much more than they? Can you really, by being worried, add a single hour to your life? And why do you worry about what you're going to wear? Look at the lilies of the field, how they grow. They don't have to work for it. Yet, I say to you that not even Solomon in all of his glory was clothed like one of those lilies. And so if God clothes the grass of the field, which is alive today and tomorrow is thrown into the furnace, will he not much more clothe you? You have little faith. You can open your eyes. I'm not going to spend a lot of time elaborating on those verses. I just kind of want them to speak for themselves. But all I want to say is, do you have a physical need? Is there something that's been on your mind that's been causing you worry, stress, anxiety? Listen, he's on it. The Lord will provide. Well, let's really get down to brass tacks and let's talk about the application. How does what we just read apply to your life and to mine? How does what we just read relate? How does it relate to our lives? Here it is. God will provide what is needed to achieve what is necessary. Remember the key thought for the day? So maybe write this down. What is it that you need? Why do you need it? Look, God is acutely aware of what you have. God is acutely aware of what you need. God will multiply what you have to achieve the necessary thing that you need. Whether it's a physical need, a spiritual need, an emotional strength. For some today, I have no doubt, the need is a financial need. There's a bill, There's a repair that is needed. There are groceries that you can't afford, medicine that's really expensive. You have a financial need. God is acutely aware of what you have. He's acutely aware of what you need, and He will multiply what you humbly give to Him in order to achieve the need that you have. So that's the first miracle. Let's move on to the second miracle contained in our text, and it's much different than the first. Let's continue reading now in our text, Matthew chapter 14, starting in verse 22 through 36. Immediately, Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of them to the other side, while He sent the crowds away. So Jesus has just finished healing the sick. They've just finished feeding their bellies. And now is the time He sends the disciples in a boat across the sea to the other side. And after Jesus had sent the crowds away, He went up onto the mountainside by Himself to pray. And it was evening. He was there alone. But the boat was already a long distance from the land, and it was being battered by the waves, for the wind was contrary. And in the fourth watch of the night, Jesus came to them, walking on the sea. When the disciples saw Him walking on the sea, they were terrified. They said, "It's a ghost!" And they cried out in fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them, saying, "Take courage, it is I. Do not be afraid." Peter said to Him, "Lord, if it is You, command me to come with You and walk on the water." And so Jesus said, "Come." And Peter got out of the boat and walked on the water and came towards Jesus. But seeing the wind, he became frightened, and beginning to sink, he cried out, "Lord, save me." Immediately Jesus stretched out His hand and took hold of him and said to him, "Oh, you have little faith. Why did you doubt?" And when he got into the boat, the wind stopped. And those who were in the boat worshipped Him, saying, "You are certainly God's Son." When they had crossed over, they came to land at Gennesaret. And when the men of the place recognized Him, they sent word into all the surrounding district and brought to Him all who were sick. See, they just heard what He had done on the other side of the shore. And the people there implored Him that they might just touch the fringe of His cloak, and as many touched it were cured. So there's the second miracle, walking on water. And as I said, this miracle is totally different than the feeding of the multitudes. But even in the midst of this unique miracle, there was a specific need that was met. These disciples are in a boat stuck on the Sea of Galilee in the middle of it, being battered by a fierce storm, the wind and the waves. You see, the Jews as well as the Romans usually divided the evening, the night, into 4 watches, 3 hours each. The first watch began at 6 p.m., the second watch at 9 p.m., the third watch of the night was midnight, and the fourth watch then would be what time? 3 o'clock in the morning. So not only are they facing a storm, it's 3 o'clock in the morning. Verse 24 gives a clearer description of this desperate situation. It reads, "The boat was already a long distance from the land, battered by waves, for the wind was contrary." They were stuck. They were being opposed by a storm, a strong storm. And in the midst of that storm, what was their need? Think on that just for a moment. What did the disciples need? Why did Jesus come walking on water? Why was this miracle performed? Maybe our initial response might be, well, they needed rescued. They were in serious trouble until Jesus showed up. And while that might be true, I want you to keep a finger in Matthew chapter 14, and I want you to flip to Mark's Gospel, chapter 6. Mark chapter 6. You understand that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John all wrote about the same time frame, right? They wrote about the events surrounding the birth, the life, the ministry, and the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. And in some of these Gospels, they record the same account, but they give different details about maybe the same account. Well, in Matthew chapter 6, Mark is writing about Jesus walking on water. And he gives us a little bit of greater insight and greater detail in Mark chapter 6. I believe in Mark chapter 6, he identifies the need for this miracle. Are you in Mark chapter 6? Look at verse 48. Let me read it for you. Jesus, seeing them straining at the oars, for the wind was against them at about the fourth watch of the night, he came to them walking on the sea, and he intended to pass them by. What? There it is. Did you see the reason why Jesus was walking on water? He intended to pass by them. Why would he do that? Well, here's what I want you to understand. That storm was no coincidence. God had them right where he wanted them. In the middle of that sea, they couldn't go anywhere. And in the middle of that sea, Jesus intended to walk by so that they could see with their own eyes, get a glimpse, be reminded of who he really and truly is. He was going to show them their glory, his glory. That he's God, that he's in control, that he's the one who provides. If you continue on in verse 51 and 52 of Mark chapter 6, you discover this. Then Jesus got into the boat with them, and the wind stopped, and they were utterly astonished, for they had not gained any insight from the incident of the loaves, but their heart was hardened. Why did Jesus perform a second miracle? Because they didn't get the first one. The feeding of all those people wasn't registering. They didn't get it. They didn't see that he is God, that he meets needs, that he takes care of those who he loves and cares about. Their hearts were hardened. Their hearts were not changed. They didn't learn any lessons about Jesus' provision. And I wonder, as those disciples were in that boat and as they were struggling at the oars, I wonder what they must have been thinking during that storm. I wonder if Peter was thinking to himself and grumbling to himself, if only we left when I suggested we leave, we could have avoided this storm. If Jesus would have just sent the people away and didn't feed them, we could have been on the other side by now. We wouldn't be out here at 3 o'clock in the morning. But let me remind you of something else. If it weren't for the storm, they wouldn't see Jesus for who he is. And so Jesus wanted to get them alone so they could see his glory more clearly. So they could learn that Jesus is the one who provides, that he can be trusted. So what did the disciples need? To see Jesus for who he is. That's what they needed. They needed to be reminded of who Jesus is. To be reassured that he is God. Let me ask you this. Do you suppose that Jesus met the need? Turn back now to Matthew chapter 14, because the answer is absolutely. They're going to get an up-close and personal realization that Jesus is who he says he is. And Peter in particular is going to get an up-close and personal encounter that Jesus is who he says he is. Matthew chapter 4, starting now in verse 27. But immediately Jesus spoke to them, saying, "Take courage, it is I, do not be afraid." Jesus is saying, see me for who I am. I am God. There's nothing to fear. Peter said to him, "Lord, if it's you, command me to come to you out on the water." And Jesus said, "Come." And Peter got out of the boat, and he walked on the water, and he came towards Jesus. But seeing the wind, he became frightened, and beginning to sink, he cried out, "Lord, save me!" Immediately Jesus stretched out his hand and took hold of him and said to him, "You have little faith. Why did you doubt?" What Peter experienced in that moment, what he was reminded of in that moment, was that Jesus has extraordinary provision. God provided what was needed in order to achieve what was necessary. Peter didn't have the resources in and of himself to walk on water, but he wanted to be with Jesus and was willing to follow and do whatever Jesus was asking him to do. And in that moment, while he was on top of the water, while he was coming to Jesus, he saw Jesus for who he truly was. Never before had Peter walked on water, and never again would Peter walk on water. But boy, this had to be one of Peter's favorite stories to tell people. And I'm sure if he was telling this people and there were other disciples around, but yeah, it sank. It didn't last real long. Hey, look, the point is this. There were 11 other disciples in the boat who weren't brave enough to get out and follow and do what Jesus had asked Peter to do. So what was the result of this need being met? What happened after Jesus revealed his glory, after they were reminded that he is indeed God? What happens? verses 32 and 33. When they got into the boat, the wind stopped, and those who were in the boat worshiped Jesus, saying, "You are certainly God's Son." Was the need met? Was the miracle a success? Absolutely. Mission accomplished. Ding, check mark. The disciples had an affirmation as to who Jesus truly was. They were assured that they could trust him. They were assured that he was going to provide for them. That everything would work out somehow. As long as they were following Jesus, everything was going to work out. Aren't we promised the same? God will work all things together for good to those who love him and for those who are called according to his purposes. Why do we forget it? Why do we forget it? Well, let's get to the application here this morning. How does what we just read apply to your life and my life? Because I firmly believe that there are some who are here this morning and you need this message. Here's the application. You're here today and you've got something going on in your life. You've got some storm raging in your life. You've got something going on that's causing you turmoil, something that's opposing you, something that is contrary to what God is calling you to. And you need to be reminded of who Jesus Christ is. You need to see him for who he is. You need him to pass by, so to speak. You need him to fully expose who he is and what he's all about. You need a little glimpse of his power. Your parents have tried to tell you, your Sunday school teacher has tried to teach you, I've tried to convince you, but you need to experience Jesus in a way that is up close and personal to you. And here's the good news. He's willing to do that for you if you invite him. He's not going to impose his will on you. He's not going to go where he's not invited to go. But if you're seeking him, if you're wanting to know that, if you're wanting to experience him in a way that you've never experienced, invite him to that. And then be prepared. Brace yourself. God will show up big time in your life. And here's the caution. It might just be in the middle of a storm when you least expect it that God will show up big time and show you who he really is and what he's all about. And just about the time that you begin to wonder yourself, why are you doing this to me, God? I'm not getting it here. He will show up. But you must look for him, or you might mistake him for a ghost. And in the middle of the storm, it just might turn out that he invites you to join him to do the impossible. I'm going to pray. And I'm going to invite our elders to come forward and just kind of stand up here this morning. And when I'm done praying, we're going to offer our time decision. And what I want our elders to do is, if you have a need here this morning, and you know very specifically what that need is. Maybe it's to have your faith strengthened so that you can believe in God. Maybe it's a financial need that you have no idea how you're going to meet it. Maybe it's a physical need of some other sort. Maybe you need to pray for healing. Maybe you've got some unsure doctor's tests, whatever the case may be. We want you to bring your need here this morning. And our elders want to pray for those needs. And so I'm going to invite our elders to come forward and just kind of stand here in the front. Brig, would you kind of come forward too? Would you mind participating in that too this morning? And just kind of hanging out here. I'm going to pray, and then we're going to offer our time decision here this morning. Will you pray with me? Father God, this morning, I'm thankful that you are a God who is powerful enough to provide. I'm thankful, God, that you have the resources at your disposal, that you can multiply what is humbly brought. And so, God, I would just ask that in this moment that your Spirit would speak and that your Spirit would move. God, I don't know the needs that are out there, but you do. You know them even before we ask of you. And all you're waiting for is for the invitation to participate in our lives in such a way that your glory can be seen. And so, God, this morning I pray that if there are needs that are here this morning, that you would allow people to come forward and to present those needs just in a one-on-one setting with our elders so they can pray for them. I pray, Father, that you would show up in each of the situations that are maybe present here in this room today in a way that people would know that it was you, your hand, that was responsible, not chance, not coincidence. God, that you'd provide abundantly. In Jesus' name we pray.